Hello and welcome to the radio room. I wanted to do a quick video concerning solder tools, a little bit of soldering basics, desoldering basics. First off, we'll take a look at some of the tools I use. This is by no means a comprehensive list of solder tools that are out there, or necessarily everything that you need at the same time. This is what I have. It's always changing. When I find something better, I use it. So let's go ahead and take a look at what I got here. Some of these I kind of consider basics. Obviously a soldering iron is going to be a basic. But a few other things that I like to use that make things a little bit easier to do soldering and desoldering. So let's take a look. So on the bench here I got several items. We'll go over a couple of these that I think are very important. Obviously the soldering iron. I have a variable soldering iron here. This is a Weller. Nice handle, cushion grip. And this is what I call my old trusty crusty. I've had this soldering iron for probably 20 years. I've been through a few tips, but it keeps on going. It's what I've done probably a good majority of my soldering in my life with in the past 20 years. A few other tools that I want to look at here. These are solder picks. These are really good. They got a nice sharp fine point on them. They're good for getting in there if you have a bent over leg or something that you want to lift up on. You can bend that up while you're unsoldering stuff. Makes things a little bit easier to get out. And of course it never hurts to have some tweezers. Nice fine tweezers right there to pick stuff up. And some straight ones in case the angle doesn't quite work. This is good for picking up small stuff like surface mount devices. Let's see here, I got my helping hands here, which I also use to keep my roll of solder on. Keeps it in one place. I can just pull it out, wind it back up when I'm done. Got some soldering flux. Definitely helps with soldering. Adds a little more flux to it, keep your solder that you're doing a little bit cleaner. This right here comes in real handy. This is just basically brass Brillo pad, or not Brillo pad, but like an SOS pad, and it's good for cleaning off your soldering iron. It knocks trash off, knocks excess solder off. And right here is just some desoldering braid. This comes in handy when you're desoldering something. It just merely wicks up the solder, keeps it from getting stuck sometimes, is the hardest part about this, but it's key to when you're using it that you lift it up at the same time, and it'll literally just soak solder right off of a pad and help you get the solder out of the way if you're trying to unsolder something. This right here is tip tinner and cleaner, and as you can see I've had this quite a while. It's just for dipping your soldering iron in. It's got flux in there. Flux helps to clean stuff off, and it'll clean off a soldering iron real well. So I always like to have a little deal of tip tinner and cleaner around. We got a desoldering pump. This is for getting in and sucking solder out of the way once you've melted it. Just a charge and reload type deal. And I do have a couple of other soldering tips here I wanted to show you. And we're going to go over here in a minute cleaning one up, but there's a couple things you need to keep in mind about your soldering iron. This one you can see it's been used quite often, and it's got a lot of crusties on it right there, but if you'll notice the tip, that tip's still shiny. That's where you want to keep it. This one I'll show you as well. I've actually got this one cleaned pretty good all the way back to here. This is the business end of it down here, but that definitely makes things a lot easier when you can keep things clean. If you want good solder joints, you've got to keep your solder tips clean. You cannot solder when it looks like that all the way at the end. So let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of things as far as the soldering tips. I'm sure you can tell on this one. But most solder joint or soldering tips, if you can tell, the tip of that back to about right here is a different color. That's because it's got a coating on there. And that coating is what protects the base metal from being eroded. It'll actually get corroded, start pitting, change shape, everything, and you won't have a good tip on there to actually solder with. This is a really fine soldering tip. This comes in handy for surface mount stuff and really small and tight areas to get into. And of course, I think I brought up the helping hands. It doesn't hurt to have something that you can maneuver around, clamp onto stuff, so that you can have both hands free while you're soldering. Also have my 230 and 150 watt soldering gun. This comes in real handy for really big stuff. There's just not enough mass right there to really get in there and solder some large stuff, say 10 gauge wire. This comes in handy for putting on connectors on coax, especially on PL259s that are soldered ones. So that comes in real handy. You have this thing for quite a while. Just a 230 and 150 watt soldering gun. And another thing I want to bring up that a lot of people don't think about as far as soldering, and that's having some isopropyl alcohol. Isopropyl alcohol, now I have 91%. I would really recommend 99%. If you're going to be soldering stuff and you're going to have flux, it doesn't matter if the flux comes out of the solder or if you add flux, it can still leave a brown mess after you're done soldering. Isopropyl alcohol, Q-tip, wipe it off gently, cleans it up great. Two reasons you want to do that. One, it looks better. Two, that solder flux, if it stays on that board, some boards it may start to etch traces, it could start to corrode traces. Most solder flux, try to make sure that you find non-corrosive if you can. That way, if it gets left on there, it's not going to be a problem. But you definitely want to clean around where you've soldered before you put everything back together and just leave that flux on the board. So let me go ahead and pause here for a minute. I'm going to clean the desk off a little bit. I think I went over everything. This is a spare soldering tip for my old trusty crusty. Went through this. Oh, one other thing that I've forgotten about. Make sure you have a sponge and keep it damp when you're soldering. That definitely comes in handy. That's great for cleaning your soldering tip off with. And we'll go over a little bit of cleaning the soldering tip and making sure that you keep it clean during your work and after your work. Make sure your tips last as long as possible. So let's go ahead and pause here. I'll clean some stuff up, and let's see if we can't turn some of these on and take a look at kind of what we're doing, and then we might unsolder a thing or two, and we might solder a couple of things together. So stay tuned. Okay, and we're back. I got the soldering irons heated up, got a little room for us to work in here. I think the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at cleaning a tip. This one's not too bad. The tip's good. I'm not going to touch that. It's hot. But we do got a lot of corrosion back here. And this is really simple. There's a couple different ways you can do that. But the tip tinner and cleaner. Remember I mentioned that this has got flux in it. I'm just going to dip it in here. And it's going to start melting. And I'm just going to let that flux really work around in there. Now I want you to be careful if you're doing this with a little can like this. This is a metal can. I'm just going to dip it a few times. I think our soldering iron is still heating up a little bit. Let's see if we can't get some of that cleaned off. Mind you, this is a very old tip that's on here. In fact, if you look at it, I'm sure you can see it quite well, but it's actually gotten worn down a little bit. See, it's supposed to be just a bevel end. And it's, see if I can get this to come into view a little bit better. It's almost kind of getting a point to it. That's why I was talking about where the flux, if it's unprotected, will start to eat into the tip a little bit. This is a really old tip that I have here, and this is probably getting pretty close to needing to be changed. We're just going to let that set a minute. Let that cook on there a minute. The soldering iron is not really getting as hot, or isn't as hot yet as I would normally have it. It's still warming up a little bit. But if nothing else, even if we don't get this one clean, like I said, this one was getting pretty close to needing to be changed anyhow. I do want you to notice something. The tip's still tinned. This does have solder in it that's tinning the end of it. You'll notice, and I'll show you here in just a minute, you can use the sponge to do this as well. Sometimes the sponge almost kind of works a little bit better, but it's a little bit cleaner. But I do want to show you something here. Solder, just regular rosin core solder here. Back in here, we have a lot of corrosion. We got a lot of built up stuff. Out here we have a clean solder tip. Now if you'll notice, this thing, it's really hard to get that to melt there. And even if I can, if it's even going to melt it, it's not going to stick. Out here, oh look at that. That solder just melts right away. And it beads up on it and sticks to it. And we still have solder on it. Notice the clean spot is the only place that's sticking. If you let the tip of your soldering tip look like that, you're not going to do any soldering. You're going to be fighting it the whole time. So let's take a look at my other soldering iron here. Mind you, I've always tinned these before I put them away. See how shiny that is? And I'll go ahead and clean it real quick too. If you get one that's really dirty, just do this a few times. Run it through that cleaner. It's not going to hurt how many times you do that. Use your sponge. Get all that oxidation off of there. That's one thing we're trying to prevent. We're trying to prevent that tip from oxidating. So as soon as you got it cleaned, tin it. Just as soon as you can. Get plenty on there. As far back as you can. Just knock off the extra. See, now that is a nice shiny tip that we can work with. This is my chisel tip. I'm sure you can tell quite in the camera, but it's a chisel tip. It's got a little wider, a little more mass there for bigger stuff versus the fine point one. And you can see it's oxidized back here, but I've gotten it clean. This one kept clean all the way back to here, and it's still holding solder. The plating only goes back to maybe right there. But we got it. I got it cleaned all the way back to there. Now, a couple of things I want to go over. First off, this can gets hot when you do that, so be careful. Go ahead and put the top on that. I'm going to go ahead and unplug this one for right now because I've gotten plenty of solder burns in the past. I don't want to stick my arm down on it and get one I don't need. So I'm going to get that one out of the way. When you're soldering, You need to make sure, pardon me just a moment, this spot of flux is about to irritate me. See that right there? I'm going to go ahead and show you something right quick. Remember I mentioned flux and isopropyl alcohol? Cleans it right up. There's the flux. When you're soldering, you need to re-tin and clean that at least every 2 solder joints. So you get done soldering, you're soldering something, dip it in there, clean it off a few times, and re-tin it. Just let it sit. That way it's ready to go the next time. When you pull it back out, dip it a couple times, solder what you need to solder. I try to do that between every solder joint, or at least every time I put it back in the holder. Just clean it off, stick it back in there. If you don't have the steel wool, just use your wet sponge. Nice and clean. Tinned. Knock all the excess off if you want to. Stick it back in there. That'll make that tip last a long time. So why don't we go ahead and look at a little bit of some soldering. Let's do an example of joining 2 pieces of wire. 2 small pieces of wire. Get my helping hands out here. And I've prepared a small piece of wire that we can work on here. This is about 20 gauge wire. Right there. I'm going to go ahead and twist these together so they're a little bit better. There's a couple different ways you can do this. A lot of people are going to tell you to twist them together and then solder them. That's fine. That's great. Might make a little more mechanical strength. But a lot of times you don't need that. You basically just need contact. And it's going to be strong enough to hold itself together. First step is, if you're going to solder wire to something, we don't want to have to deal with trying to get the solder into the wire before we're actually soldering or sticking it to something. So we're going to tin this, which is quite simple. Just going to heat the wire some, and I'm touching the wire, not the soldering iron. Actually, might have got a little bit too much on that one. As you can see, that wire is completely tinned. That's going to make life a lot easier. And we're going to do the same thing to this one. Drop my wire. Do the same thing to this one. And when you're going to do this, make sure you got a little bit of solder on your soldering iron. That's going to help conduct the heat from the iron to the wire. Just as easy as that. Now, when I'm going to join 2 wires, I'm not sure you can see this quite simply, but on the end of that wire, I actually left a little bit of a blob of solder. That's going to help us out a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and add just a little bit of solder to this one. Just a little bit of extra solder. And I'm just going to join them together, or at least have one held. I can do this by hand as well. Don't want it moving around too much. Don't get too close if you're using alligator clips. This insulation right here is going to get warm. You don't want to start having your alligator clip start getting into the solder. This is the really simple way to do this. Clean that up. I'm going to add a little solder to my soldering iron. Got a little blob there. I'm just going to line these up side by side, touch them together. Let that solder flow between the two of them. Hold it there for a minute. I got a little hot on my fingers, so I had to back off of it a little bit. That's why I was saying sometimes the helping hands can actually help on this. And that is joined together. Heat shrink that, tape it if you want to. That's not the prettiest one right there. I got a little hot on the insulation there, but that's going to last. It's got good solder between the two, and it's going to stay put. So maybe you want to have a little bit bigger wire. You don't want to fight with having to hold it. And you want to do the twist method. Now, a lot of folks, they start here and twist together. How about you start in the middle? Get them about a right angle to each other. That's one way to do it, but I don't really like that way. So I'm going to cut this off and I'm going to start over, because I want my wires in line with each other. I don't want that big bulge out there. Tighten up the strands a little bit. I'm going to bend that. I'm going to bend this one. Now, I've got them crossing each other. Twist this one around. Twist the other one around. Get them nice and tight. Now we've got a structural connection there. Now, we're going to see if we can solder this. This gauge wire might be a little much for this. We'll see here in just a minute. If that's the case, we'll break out the soldering gun and do it. I want to make good contact with it, and I might need to add a little bit more so we can transfer to it. Let's see, we're getting good transfer. I'm touching the wire, not the soldering iron. The soldering iron's there just to heat stuff up. So I'm just going to fill this wire right where they're joining with solder. And we'll let that cool. Now we put a lot of heat to that, so we're going to let that cool off a minute before we touch it. And always remember, if you're going to put heat shrink on this, make sure you do it before you put the wires together. Good tight joint. All soldered together. Alright, so we've touched a little bit on that. There's a couple of things I want to go over with you before we move on to maybe desoldering some stuff, soldering on a board, and it's placement of your soldering iron on the joint. I did a couple of drawings here for you. Hopefully we don't have too much glare on this. Alright, so this is a solder joint. We got our leg sticking up. This is our board. That's our solder joint. Now if you'll notice, this is our soldering iron tip. You don't put the tip onto the joint. You don't get good conduction that way. That's why I got an X around that one. This is closer to what you want. It's a little hard to describe this, but when you have your joint, and I'll show you on a board here in just a moment, you want as much of that area of the soldering tip in contact with the solder as possible. That's why you have the flat edge, and you add a little bit of solder to it, and that's going to help conduction around. But right here, you don't want to just be trying to heat through a tiny little point. You're going to heat this area up just slightly in this area, but you're going to find yourself fighting with it. And you're going to be sitting there for a long time trying to get that to melt. So get as much of that area of the side of the soldering tip. Let me see if I can grab a soldering tip real quick to make contact with that. Let me just show you this one right here. It might have cooled down by now. Yeah. If I'm using just the point, I have very little contact. I'm just putting this up against something. Very little contact. So I'm saying is that you want to follow that angle and put as much surface as you can into that joint. It's going to heat it up. It's going to heat it up quicker, and you're not going to be just sitting there dwelling on it. With wire, we had our wire, and if you'll notice, when I was soldering that, I did not come in like this. I don't have a lot of surface area heating right there. I came in at an angle so I could use the side of that soldering iron right there on the tip of it to transfer as much heat as quickly as possible as I could. So that's what I'm talking about here. Don't go straight onto it and expect that to solder. Get along the side of it. Get as much area as you can transferring heat to that area. The solder that's on the tip will also help conduct that heat, but it'll help conduct it from that whole area. That's going to heat it up quicker. You sit here like this, for one, you're going to frustrate yourself by the time you ever get enough heat into it to heat it. Two, whereas you might be putting heat into here and the wire is heating up, it's giving it more time for that heat to conduct down the wire. Well, if you remember, on this one, I melted the solder a little bit right there. And that's because it wasn't quite cooperating with me and I dwelled too long. So it started conducting heat down here to the point I couldn't even hold on to it. I had to actually try again. And it melted the insulation right there. Well, we don't really want to do that. So get as much heat in there as quickly as possible, get the solder joint done, and get off of there. It doesn't give as much time for that heat to be radiating or conducting out through the wire before you get this hot enough. You stick it on there, get it hot enough, melt it, solder it, and off of there. By that time you haven't put as much energy into this that's being conducted away from that joint into the wire, possibly melting insulation or burning your fingers if you're holding onto the wire. So let's pause a moment. I'm going to find a board. Let's take a look at a board and see if we can't desolder and maybe solder something back in. We'll be right back. So I've got an old CB radio here. It's one of my parts radios. Still got quite a few parts in it as well. Cut the cord off of it, pulled the volume and on off out of it a while back. Let's go ahead and see about unsoldering this speaker. Get a little bit of unwinding on the wires here. And spread them out a little bit. And this is a pretty simple one. This is pretty much going to be put it on there, pull the wire off type deal. Hopefully. They may have twisted the wire around the connector. So I'm cleaning my soldering iron. I'm going to re-tin it. Knock the extra off. Let's see if we can just get in there and pull it right off. Oh, look at that. See, those are just contacts soldered on there. And I'm going to go ahead and finish taking this off of here so we can get this speaker and cover out of the way. Now look at it. I'm not going straight onto it. I'm not going straight off the tip. I'm going to use the side of it. This is a chisel. So it's got a broadside on it. I'm going to use that broadside and put it on there. And right off of there. Clean my soldering iron. Like I said, either this, you can use this, and immediately retin it. That solder forms a film, a layer on there that keeps oxygen from getting to that heated tip. Heated metal likes to oxidize. So we're getting this out of the way. Okay, so we've got lots of little stuff in here. Here's the back side of the board. Got lots of surface mount on here. We got some through hole stuff. Got a little capacitor back in here. A little electrolytic capacitor. Some transformers. Some variable inductors. Let's see what we want to take out of here. Trying to find something that's going to give us a good example of desoldering. Let's see. How about this guy here? Got an electrolytic capacitor here. Just got to find out where exactly it is on the board. Looks like it's these two right here. Make sure I can get the glare out of there. These two right here. Those are two we're going to try and do. Okay, so like I'd mentioned before, there's a couple of different ways to do this. We have solder braid, we have a solder sucker. I'm starting with some flux. I'm just going to put a little solder flux on those two pins. Reason being because it's likely I'm going to, if I'm working on something, I'm not just going to pull a component out and not worry about the board. So that's going to help clean that area. So when I do go back, say I'm replacing this capacitor, we're going to have cleaner pads right there. Let's try the solder sucker first. Armed? And just a touch of solder. Now, I'm going to put the edge of that right in like that. As soon as I see it melt, I'm going to suck the solder off of there. Now let's see if I can get this to the point where you can see it. Remember, take care of your tip. Not sure if you can see this very well. I got to try and get the glare out of it at the same time. Right here, you can see There's no solder around that. There's very little solder left at it. It sucked it right out of there. So now we're going to try this one. Well, let's try soldering braid, just to see what we do here. I don't have a real clean end. This is obviously used. In fact, I've just ordered some more. This roll here, as you can see, it says Radio Shack. I've had this for a long time. I'm just about out. It used to be full. Now, desoldering braid works by when you heat it up, it wicks the solder into it so that you can pull it away. But I'm actually going to add just a drop of flux to my soldering braid. It's going to clean the copper that it's made out of, and it's going to make the solder actually wick up into it even better. Now, I put the soldering braid between the joint, which is right here, and the soldering iron. I just stick it in between there, and I push into it. This is sometimes a little more difficult when you're in small areas. And lift them both together. Now, if you can see the end of that, it's wicked up some of the solder. And this is why you end up going through this, because once you've used some, cut off that solder point. Now, this one's starting to be a little bit contrary. Now, this might seem counterintuitive. I'm actually going to add solder to this joint. I like that. Get some fresh solder on there. It's got a little fresh flux. It's actually going to help grab that solder. Now, I'm not using right at the very end of the flux or the braid. I'm doing it so I can just bend it in there. Pull some out. Cut that off. And we'll do it again. Now, obviously that took a little bit longer than the solder sucker. Sometimes you can't get this in there. And we're looking pretty clean. And I'm reaching through the other side of the radio, and I'm pulling that right out. No solder left. I used one, I wicked it up with the solder wick. The other one, I sucked it out all at once. So there's our electrolytic capacitor that we've pulled out. Now let's put it back in. Let's find the holes. Now I'm remembering which way I pulled this out. There's not a lot to mark on. Actually there is, right there. That's the cathode side of it. I'll show you this right now. It's the mark side of it. So electrolytics can only go in one way. I'll slide right back through the holes. And I'm actually going to find something to hold this up in there. Normally I turn this on the side and solder it in there. I'm actually going to set this like this to hold it up in there. Normally I'd just set it on the side and call it good. That's not working out real well either, is it? Well, maybe this wire will help us. Just want to hold it up into the hole since I'm flipping it upside down. And right here is our two legs. Nice and clean. Keep it clean. Tin it. Just gonna knock some extra off. Now, I do not solder. Nobody should solder. You do not solder by touching the iron. You want to heat the metals that you want to solder and then touch on the opposite side of it, if at all possible. Now let me show you one other thing first. Let's also go ahead and put a little bit of solder flux on there. That cleans it. Cleans the copper traces. It cleans the leads on the capacitor in this case. Just gonna stick that in there. Heat it. Solder it. Let's check it. We got good coverage. It doesn't take much. These are pretty small pins. Heat it. Touch it. Sit there just a second. And then check it. See, I don't like that one. Didn't really suck it in. So we'll clean our soldering iron up a little bit. Get us a little more tinning action going on. Come in again. Heat it. Solder it. And in this case I can see, I don't think you guys can see. We have a nice cone of solder all the way around it. It goes to the edges of where the exposed pad were. It's shiny. One thing when you're soldering, you don't put it on there and then blow on it. You don't want that solder joint to cool too fast. Otherwise it'll be a cold solder joint. You want that heat to hold on to it and absorb it. The copper will literally wick it in to a certain degree. You're basically fusing two metals. You're forming an alloy between the tin lead, if you have leaded, and the copper. And it happens underneath that heat that does that. So that's got that back in there. So that's removing a component. Now I'm going to go ahead and pause at this moment, and I'm going to let my soldering iron cool down a little bit, and then we might go over a little bit of a few other things that we might want to do. Maybe we'll remove a surface mount component. They're a whole lot easier to remove than put on, but maybe we'll remove if I can find a good one here. Maybe we'll remove a surface mount component. But we'll be right back. Okay, and we're back. Now, I've changed my mind. Before I have to change the soldering tip to do a removal of a surface mount component, let's use get another practical point of soldering here while I still have my chisel tip on there. I have a switch here. It's just a regular on-off switch. Got it in my helping hands. These come in very handy. I'm just going to use this same wire. I'm actually going to unsolder this. Make sure I got a clean tin iron. Now this is another reason why, if you don't have to have a lot of structural strength, if you didn't heat shrink this, you could just cut the heat shrink off and it's apart. So we're going to use these as the wires. We would have already tinned these. Just going to even out the tin on these. Now on our switch, this is a used switch. It's a little grimy, a little messed up a little bit. So I'm actually going to clean that up a little bit and re-tin it. I'm going to put some solder flux on it, help clean it. I'm going to re-tin these. Get some clean solder on there. Now, we already have tinned wire, and that's really important when you're soldering to something like this. For one, it's already got this filled. It's not dirty because it's sealed in solder. And I've actually got a blob of solder on there. This is going to help you because you don't have three hands. Now there's two ways I can do this. I can either do a contact solder, like that. Or if my wire was small enough, I could stick it through the hole. Depends on your application. Is it going to need to have that extra strength of going through the hole? Well, whatever you do, I would suggest that if you ever plan on needing to undo the wire, don't wrap it. There's really no point in wrapping it. A lot of times you'll see something there through the hole, then they wrap it around the leg. There's really no point in that. Let me see if the hole is big enough. You can actually stick this through. I'm thinking not. So we're just going to do a contact. We don't want to be on it any longer than we need to. I'll show you why, because we've already started melting the contact. This is an old switch. So I'm not really worried about if we mess it up or not. See how it fell apart? That was a cold solder joint. So something in here is actually pulling a lot of heat into it. I think that was a messed up switch to begin with. It shouldn't have been moving around like that to begin with. Let me see if I can find something that's a little better shape. This switch is pretty bad shape to begin with. So let's see here. Let's do a momentary contact switch. Brand new. Give me my helping hands. I'm actually going to clean some of that off. I'm going to tin this real quick. Just a little bit of flux on there. Flat side to it, heat it up, tin it real quick. Now if you're actually going through the holes, you don't want to tin this first. Just real quick like that. Take our wire that's already tinned. Looking a little dull, probably got a little oxidation on it. I'm actually going to clean this up just a little bit with some flux. We're just going to contact solder it on there. As soon as I see it mold together with some, that's a lot better than what we were doing on the other one. And we'll see if we can't find the wire, or we'll get some wire. Let's go ahead and get some wire. We'll re-tin it and everything. And normally on something like this, we wouldn't have this much exposed. We just need a little bit for these switches. So. Tinned and ready to go on. So I can get this down here where you guys can see it. Broadside of my chisel. And it's attached. And like I said, if you don't need to have a lot of, this isn't going to be flopping around. You don't need a bunch of mechanical strength on this, and there's nothing going to be moving it around much. Just do a contact solder. Because if you ever have to come in here and redo it, it's as easy as that to unhook it. Remember, make sure you keep cleaning that thing. You don't have to do it every time. Keep some fresh solder on there and you will definitely like it in the long run. And that's a perfectly reusable momentary contact switch right there. That'll go back in the drawer. So let me pause again, get it set back up. We're going to desolder a surface mount device. We might not go through the soldering it back on there. That's a little more entailed than just taking it off. One thing I do want to point out on surface mount stuff is you're always taking a gamble. If you remove a surface mount device, they're very small. They absorb heat fairly quickly. Once you take one off, there's no guarantees that the device hasn't been damaged. You're putting heat to it. So when working with surface mount, you got to be quick. Try to be as quick as possible, just enough to get the solder loose, or if you're putting it back on, to get the solder to flow and to stick. You don't want to put any more heat to it than that. So let's go ahead and pause here. I'm going to change the tip. It's a little big for surface mount stuff. But one thing I am going to do is I'm going to clean it really well, because I'm putting it away. This would be the same thing as if you're just shutting off your soldering iron for the evening. I'm going to get it really clean. And I'm going to put a nice coating of solder on it. As far back as it'll take it. Knock off the extra. Shut her down. Okay, so I'm back. I've changed a little few things on the bench here. We're going to see if we can't take off a surface mount component. Specifically, we're going to take this little bitty capacitor off right here. Now, I covered a few tools early in the video. They're pretty important for soldering with. Like I said, you don't have to have all of them. A lot of them just make life a little bit easier. And maybe it's not even everything you would need. But there's one thing, if you're going to be working on surface mount, is these magnifiers. They're going to make your world so much better. Let me see if y'all can see how this difference is. This is not a full, this is only a 1.5 times. But you can see it definitely makes things bigger. And that's going to make things a lot easier. It's going to be easier on your eyes. So put those on and get ready to go. Now, changed my tip out. I have the narrow tip on. It's going to get into those smaller areas better. Doesn't have quite as much heat sinked in the end of it. I'm going to go ahead and give it a clean here. Since I'm just using it for the first day, could have got some dirt on it, a little bit of dust, something like that. So we'll just clean it off. And then we'll re-tin it. Nice and shiny. See how it takes solder so easily? So if I go back here, can't even hardly get it to take it. Knock a little extra off. I'm going to go ahead and put a little flux in the area. Help keep things clean. Seal it off. Keep oxygen getting to it while we're doing it. I think what we're going to do is, let's see if we can't get the solder off of one side of it using the solder wick. Got quite a bit of it off. I know you're not going to be able to see this in the video. Just too small, and I don't have zoom yet. That might come in the future. Now, from the looks of this, we've got most, if not all, of the solder off the side of that capacitor. So I'm going to turn this radio around. And we're going to cheat a little bit. I got my nifty little tweezers here. And I'm going to hold on to that capacitor while I'm doing this. And then I'm just going to get in here and touch the other side. And apparently I do not have enough off of the other side to get it, let it just come free. So we'll see if we can't get some more off of the other side. Basically what I'm doing is I'm trying to get one side just about completely free, and then we can lift the whole thing off by releasing the other side. So let's try some more solder wick. Put a little bit of flux on it. Now if you decide to buy solder wick, they actually sell solder wick that already has flux in it. This doesn't. I'm just going to stick it in there. See if I can't wick up some more. Now most of what I got there was actually from the iron. So notice I'm putting just a little bit of a fold in the end of it. So when I set it down in there, I can get better heat transfer. Now the downside of solder wick, you can't always get it down into that joint all the way. So maybe we'll try the solder sucker. It always seems like you're fighting with surface mount ones. And I'm just trying to see if I can't show you all the way to do this with a soldering iron. Because not everybody's got all the specialized tools to do this. Let's see if I can just raise that side up just a little bit. Sometimes you almost got to walk these things off of here. But I'm trying not to put too much heat to the component at the same time. This one really wants to stay. So let's try taking some solder off of the other side. Then maybe we can get it to walk. Got some more off of there. So that cleaned off a lot off of that side there. So we might be able to walk it off from the other side now. Don't want too much extra solder on your soldering iron when you're working on surface mount. You just want enough to help conduct the heat. This is one very well stuck capacitor. Up, and there it is. Just had to get just enough heat to it that it broke that solder joint free right there. I don't think you can see it on this one. There actually wasn't any solder left. We just needed to get this side hot enough that it would release. Now, I'm going to see if I can put it back on there. How I'm going to do this, I'm going to clean up my soldering iron. Mind you, I'm still holding the tiny little capacitor. I'm going to like load my soldering iron just a little bit, and I'm going to put just a little bit. Let me go ahead and put some flux back on there. I'm going to see I can put just a dab of solder. See, now I've got just a little bit of a solder pad. The other side I didn't put any on yet. I'm going to set that end. I may be getting in my own way here. Let's set it where it needs to be. Solder that side in. I'm going to sit there a moment. I don't want to move this thing around. I want to make sure it is stuck before I let go. Now it's in there. Turn around because I'm right-handed. I don't like to work at things backwards. Now this side we have a clean solder joint. I'm going to put some flux back on it because I want to keep this stuff nice and clean. I'll load my soldering iron. I'm going to clean it up real nice. Got a little bit of sponge on the end of my deal. Now you can almost see I've cleaned basically all the solder, the tin off of there, so I'm going to re-tin it good. Knock the excess off. I'm going to put just a touch on there. I'm going to put that touch back on there, get it just warm enough to make sure I know I'm getting contact with the end, and now I have a good solder joint on that one. The other one was just a tack, so I'm going to examine it. See if it looks good. If I don't like it, I got the other side holding the capacitor. I'll just touch it up a little bit. And there, we've got it back on there. So they're not too hard, it just takes a little bit of work to do them. Take my goggles off. Now, clean a few things up here. So we've unsoldered and soldered that capacitor over here. That's called a through hole. And we've unsoldered and resoldered a surface mount device. And you can't really tell. Let me see if I can get this. Right in here we got this little discoloration. It looks kind of white. That's the flux. It's where it just kind of spread out and stuff. So I'm going to take my alcohol, and on a Q-tip, clean this up. don't worry about, oh, you're putting liquid on the circuit board. It's going to evaporate. Now, like I said before, I'm using 91 because that's what I could get. I was getting alcohol during the great COVID pandemic, and if you got alcohol at all, you nearly had to make it yourself. Couldn't get any 99. So this is what I got. This huge bottle is all I could get. So at some point in time, I will get some 99, 99.1, 99.9% isopropyl alcohol. If you can, let me see if I can get this in the light again. As you can see, I've gotten all that flux off of there. So it looks nice and clean right in there. See if we can't find where we did that. We also have some right here. Now mind you, this is a junk radio. It's just a parts radio. I wouldn't normally worry about this too much. Just clean everything up in that area. Everything where that flux went, just cleaning it off. Be careful, because sometimes your Q-tip kind of comes apart, but that's dry. It's already dry. So it dissolves it, it cleans it, and it evaporates. It's gone. It's going to be safe to use no matter what. Just give it a couple of minutes. Make sure everything's dry, especially if you're around some stuff that might soak up underneath it. You'll get some underneath it. You might want to give it a few more minutes to kind of evaporate out of there. Obviously, don't be trying to get alcohol down into, these variable inductors or whatnot. It's not going to really do it any good, and it's going to take quite a while for it to come out. So that's my old junk parts radio to get components out of. I think that's just about got what I wanted to cover in this video. We'll probably have some more in the future covering some other soldering basics, maybe a little more involved stuff. At some point in time we'll get the hot air rework out, work on it a little bit, show you some stuff on that. Gonna have some videos coming up that are going to cover electronics basics, Ohm's law, what amps are, voltage, resistance. We'll probably get into some capacitance, inductance, and just kind of getting some basics of that. Work on some of the equations, especially Ohm's law, the power equation, stuff like that, so that we can start building from there, and we'll have an understanding of kind of what's going on when I'm referencing Ohm's law. And just hopefully, kind of make some stuff that's kind of basic stuff, but there might be a lot of people out there that, when you've done electronics for quite a while, some of the basics seem really, really basic. But if you're just coming into electronics, say you've just gotten your amateur radio license, or you're just getting into kind of tinkering with electronics, some things that guys have done for 20, 30 years might seem common knowledge, and they're not. I've had a few conversations with some people here recently, and they've asked me some questions that really let me understand that you've got to know at the basics of it before you can go further than that. So we're going to try and build from there. Have some videos that hopefully, as we build, one video might lead to another video, which will take that information and you'll use it in the next video. So I'm hoping that we've learned a little bit about soldering today. I'm going to, like I say, keep your tips clean. I'm going to clean mine up, fluff my wool up here a little bit. I'm going to clean it up real good. I'm going to be putting it away. So I want to make sure it's nice and clean and tinned before I put it away. And another thing, if you do have flux, even just this flux, now paste works better for this, but if you don't have the tip tinner and cleaner, a little flux on there, it'll help clean it off. I like this because it's more of a paste. It melts it, really gets into it, and it tins it at the same time. I literally could walk away from that right there. It's got a lot of flux in there, and I don't like leaving a lot of flux. So I just clean it up, get a nice amount of solder on there, knock off the extra, make sure everybody looks covered good, and I put it away. Turn it off. It's going to keep it from getting oxidized while it's just sitting there. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you'll subscribe. Give me a thumbs up if you like it. Leave comments if you like. 'Cause you never know. Maybe you see something that maybe have a suggestion on the way things could be done a little bit better. If you never quit learning while you're working on electronics, then you're doing something wrong. And if you think you know it all, you're definitely thinking wrong. So I'm doing this, and I learn things as we go along as well. So maybe I look at something a little bit different because I'm explaining it to somebody, and I might go, you know what? Maybe that doesn't make quite as much sense of why I've been doing it that way. So I learned something new just because I'm explaining it to somebody else. Sometimes that's the best way to learn, is try to explain a concept to somebody else, and it'll actually cement it in your own mind. So, like I said, go ahead and subscribe. Give me a thumbs up if you like the video, and we'll see you next time on another episode of The Radio Room.